action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try.
Hello and welcome to Call to Action, the go-to podcast for anyone trying to make sense of the world of marketing and advertising. It's brought to you by Gasp, and I'm Giles Edwards, co-founder and MD. This episode is the most eagerly anticipated part 2 since the Godfather movie series, being the second half of our chat with a man who is arguably the Don of Behavioural Economics in 2019, the one and only Rory Sutherland. We bravely stopped Rory with a loud gong in part 1. There really was no other way. But we now return to our chat with the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy UK as we talk about an event that is the jewel in the behavioural economics crown, Nudgestock. If you haven't caught part 1, make sure you do, as it was packed with great informative stuff on advertising, marketing, magic, branding fish, and a whole lot more. But now it's time to sit back and enjoy the return of the Rory. Can we plug Nudgestock? Because Nudgestock has been plugged in previous episodes, not least by ourselves, but by Richard Shotton and Stephen Colgin, who's been on stage a couple of times at Nudgestock.
He's a wonderful guy, both wonderful guys, fantastic guys.
Absolutely are. But as we're talking to the front man, it would be amiss of me not to bring up Nudgestock. So can you tell our listeners a bit more about it?
It will be somewhere on the coast of England, or at least somewhere outside London, but accessible from London, on the second Friday of 2020. That will be the next one. Okay. So the date doesn't vary. Second Friday in June. Sorry, did I say the second Friday of 2020? God. Second Friday in June of 2020, somewhere within easy reach of London, possibly by the sea, second Friday.
Possibly by the sea, so we're not definitely remaining coastal.
Well, we may have outgrown all seaside venues, with the possible exception of the Brighton Centre, which is another consideration. But let's go and see.
Okay.
What we try and do is we get really interesting, non-standard thinkers from behavioral science, behavioral economics, including actually people like Gerald Ashley, a great guy in the city who talks about the difference between risk and uncertainty, and how fundamentally different rules apply for intervening in those two conditions. And we get what you might call the top flight of people from around the world, fly them in, and they speak to a mixed audience of marketers, advertising people, Ogilvy employees, their own clients, and also simply we keep the ticket price low. That's one of the reasons we're outside London. Students and indeed outside people who are just interested in this stuff. Okay. Now, the vital thing there is that it's a kind of annual reminder that a lot of progress is being made in this area. I mean, it will never be the kind of progress, I think, that leads to complete silver bullet stuff. But it's important to remember, by the way, that progress in science doesn't only consist in eureka. It also consists in maybe it isn't like that at all. The rejection of bad ideas or the rejection of false certainty is as much part of the scientific process as the achievement of certainty. And it's a fantastic mix of practitioners. So we had the behavioral science team from Uber speaking. We had the chief economist of Spotify speaking. It will be a mixture of practitioners and academics, all essentially communing around the idea that I think there's a possibility to elevate both the stature and the efficacy and the influence. Probably the influence is the most important, because without influence, it's very difficult to be effective. Okay, of marketing style thinking or psychologically led thinking and complexity led thinking genuinely deserves to have, I would say, 5 times the influence over everything from public policy making to business decision making that it currently does. And so I'm dedicated to the idea that I'd also say that the interesting thing about people in marketing and advertising, Amos Tversky used to say that what Daniel and I do is we take things which are already known instinctively by advertising executives and car salesmen, and we put them in a recognizable, codifiable form. And in the same way, what Robert Cialdini, who I think is one of the real greats in this area, he embedded himself as an academic with sales forces to find out what they did to change people's minds. And he discovered lots of the practices varied from one sector to another, but some things seemed to have universal persuasive power. Interestingly, by the way, those things, Cialdini's big 6 principles, are weirdly contradictory. This is my point, by the way, that, depending on context, the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea. So scarcity sells, but so does social proof, to give an example, okay?
Yeah.
So, that's another reason why I think people have been messed up in attempts to make marketing into a science, because there are actually 2 very effective ways to sell something. Not many people have one of these, so it must be great. And lots of people have these, so it must be pretty good.
And equally, it's based on the idea that consumers are maximizers and not satisficers.
Now that was the basis of my talk. Now, so I plugged Nudgestock, I hope, for next year. What I'm also saying is we will shortly be pitching up the talks online.
Brilliant.
So keep an eye. Now I'm just trying to think where the best place would be. It'll be on YouTube. So if you Google Nudgestock 2019 on YouTube, the talks by one of the people we've been trying to get for the last 6 years, Gerd Gigerenzer, who is one of the world's leading experts on decision making under uncertainty, maximizing versus satisficing, and the use of heuristics. My contention that most humans most of the time are trying to minimize downside variance more urgently than they're trying to optimize upside expectation, which I think also explains why people pay a premium for brands. I don't think we choose brands because we think they're great. I think we choose brands because we think they're definitely not terrible. And I think marketers spend far too much time worrying about the addition of positives rather than the removal of negatives in many respects. And I think by looking at what humans, and I mean specifically humans, are instinctively trying to do, and what evolution has taught humans to do, we can understand human motivation and indeed human happiness rather better, and therefore design a world for human perception rather than for sort of objective purity. And it's interesting because in the where that sits is quite interesting, because in the if you're a nudger in the US, it tends to mean you're a Democrat. And indeed, Obama picked up on the nudge unit, and indeed it was headed by someone fantastic called Maya Shankar, who now works for Google. Weirdly, on the political spectrum in the UK, nudging seems to be a conservative or possibly Lib Dem, but it seems to be a slightly right of centre area of interest. So in terms of libertarian paternalism, the American right have such a horror of paternalism that they regard this as horrible. Whereas, of course, the libertarian right in the UK like the fact that it gives government something to do without actually curtailing human freedoms. My guess would be that a moderate Labour Party might be equally amenable to this. A Corbynite one is less likely to be, because I would argue that very, very left-wing thing, it's very interesting to notice how male it is, isn't it, for the most part? But it's all about this sort of false certainty of having some sort of left-wing theory that explains everything. It's very interesting. This a very interesting thing. If you look at all those theories that supposedly explain everything, okay, if you take Adam Smith, you take Immanuel Kant, you take John Stuart Mill, you take Nietzsche, okay, you could add in Jeremy Bentham, right? All those people are really weird, aren't they? I mean, like Adam Smith lived with his mum. Newton died a virgin. Jeremy Bentham was totally batshit weird. Immanuel Kant, OCD. Okay. Very interesting question. Why do we borrow our theories of life from people who are really real outliers? What we should want is a philosophy of life from Mick Jagger, shouldn't we? That's we should look for people who are actually really, really successful in a Darwinian kind of way, and we should try and model ourselves on them.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, there is a guy. I think there is a guy who does this, by the way, which is Shakespeare. I think the guy who is probably the best behavioral scientist is a kind of in terms of being a complete human being. That's what we should aspire to in leading our lives and understanding life. That's the kind of role model we should have, not the kind of weird, narrow, reductionist theory which tends to come out from people who are massively non-neurotypical. And I just asked the question, that if you look at the strange thing that people who come up with successful universal theories for things themselves seem decidedly weird. So anyway, sorry, I digress. So anyway, Google Nudgestock 2019 and search for it on YouTube, and within a month or so, Gigerenza's talk will be up. We're absolutely delighted. A fantastic talk by Sir Paul Collier, wonderful talk by Tricia Wang, fantastic talk by Stephanie Johnson.
Yeah.
A whole bunch of people speaking there. Now, I think, again, a very simple thing, a change in perspective is worth 40 IQ points, as a guy famously said, and I can't remember his name. Very great expert in interface design. And I think that's what this is all about. That actually what we need in policy making, what we need in business is at least the capacity to flip perspective from time to time. And I think all the dominant ideologies, whether the neoliberal one on the right or the kind of trotty one on the left, actually are hugely deleterious to the prospect of flipping perspective. And what you see in Paul Collier is, what I think every Nudgestock speaker has in common is they have this capacity to go. Robert Frank is another speaker this year. The capacity to go, you could look at this as this, or you could look at it like that. Now, a very interesting case of Robert Frank's is he argues that the rich should actually be perfectly content to pay more tax, because rich people are mostly preoccupied in buying property where they're competing for that property with other rich people. Okay, so if you actually reduce the wealth of the rich, you improve the public environment without really making the competition for rivalrous goods any worse. And he says that people assume that when you get poorer, weirdly, when you get poorer and everybody else gets poorer, this is among the rich, okay, your welfare doesn't suffer very much. Your welfare suffers if you get poorer and nobody else does. But because tax actually evens out the impoverishment, for people above a certain threshold of wealth, in fact, they may not experience any net loss in happiness. On the contrary, they may experience a gain.
That was a fantastic talk, actually, and I think that alongside Tricia Wang discussing thick data as opposed to big data was certainly a highlight for us this year.
No, I mean, we will find it difficult to top that in 2020. I'll be absolutely honest with you. That's one of the things I'm worrying about now. Well, I'm sure we'll manage somehow. I think at some point we'll have to start inviting people back, because we've never had anybody speak twice, apart from me, but I do the kind of introduction blurb. Okay, and we've never had anybody speak twice, and I think at some point we'll have to do that, because I want to hear, Nassim spoke at Nudgestock number 1 8 years ago. I think we need to hear, he's since written 2 books, okay. I think we need to hear the latest work. So I think that's one thing we'll have to do again.
That wouldn't put anyone off, Rory.
Well, no, I think it's wrong like comedy, isn't it? The whole question of, at what speed do you recycle your material? And there was one comedian who made a terrible mistake, because they thought when they first started in stand-up, they thought it had to be new every time. Now, the interesting thing is, in comedy, I think that the standard rule is every year, over the course of a year, you should end up with a new routine. In other words, in a year's time, your routine should borrow only maybe 10% or less from the routine you had a year ago. but nonetheless, trying to give every time you go to a new venue. First of all, the repeat audience is small. Secondly, in all honesty, a lot of people don't mind hearing the same joke twice.
No.
What does kill you as a comedian is you go on TV, you see, because it's the huge dilemma for a stand-up comedian, because you gain a huge level of fame and your ability to fill large venues goes up, but at the same time you burn all your material because people grudge a bit. I'm not entirely, but people certainly wouldn't pay 50 quid to go and turn up and see a routine that they'd seen in its entirety on television.
No, this is true. Although I have made that mistake a couple of times, I must admit.
Tell me how.
I've seen two comedians on this identical tour, once at the start and once near the end.
And it was exactly the same, was it?
Exactly the same. There was a couple of improv bits, but yeah, it was exactly the same. But to be honest, I enjoyed it just as much the second time. So,
well, this is the weird thing. I mean, there's also the little bits of refinement. Stuart Lee writes about in his book about his own comedy, which is describing, I think, Gary Lineker like a velvet owl. Now, apparently, that emerged through lots and lots of experimentation, and part of the reason, of course, is that the really hot comedians will if you're really interested in this stuff, seeing them at the beginning and seeing them at the end, and seeing the small changes they've made.
Yeah,
it's rather like interestingly, I always remember Douglas Adams used to dissect paragraphs of P.G. Wodehouse, because what fascinated him with P.G. Wodehouse was that you could take a P.G. Wodehouse paragraph or sentence, and if you just changed a word slightly or you flipped the word order slightly, it was no longer funny. And he'd spend a whole load of time dissecting exactly what it is that made the sentence perfectly funny and unimprovable. And it's a really interesting lesson. So, Wodehouse, I think, which I've always noticed in comedy, is David Ogilvy was the advertising copywriter equivalent. The use of one fancy word. Generally, you write simply, but chucking in the odd sort of 4-syllable word somehow can make something seem funnier. And, understanding those funny little tricks and how they work. There's a great book, actually, by Jimmy Carr and another author who was an advertising copywriter, the co-author, I can't remember her name, which is all about an analysis of humor, and called The Naked Jape, it might be called. But that's really interesting in itself too, because understanding the fact that there's, again, in humor there are butterfly effects. It's always fascinated me. If you take that ad for Cronenberg, which featured Eric Cantona,
yes,
and he's pretending to be a hop farmer, not a footballer, in order to pull attractive women in the bars of Alsace. Okay.
Yes.
And he breaks the fourth wall and makes this little knowing conspiratorial smile to the camera at the end when he says, "Of course, I'm a farmer," you see.
Yeah.
And now his ability, the ad stands or falls. Now, luckily, I think Cantona being, one of those people who is kind of, he's a kind of wide genius, isn't he? He's one of those people who, had he not been a footballer, he would have been pretty great at something else. I don't think you'd say that about all footballers, but I would suspect that of Eric. The interesting thing is his ability to carry that off essentially was the make or break thing for the ad. And you get that in all forms of communication. It's interesting, actually, that we're seeing an increasing number of comedians being elected, and I include Boris in this, I think. But, if you look at Beppo in Italy or the new Ukrainian president, who I think is a comedian or stand-up comedian or something, the fact that we're seeing that in politics is kind of weird and interesting. That maybe what it is that people in comedy know how to communicate in a way that people who simply operate within the technocratic technosphere have lost the talent.
I actually concluded on Richard Shotton's episode that Boris was rather a physical embodiment of the Pratfall Effect.
Well, it's very interesting the fact that you have people with visible failings suddenly being appealing, which is that if you think about it, you look at the governmental class now and the homogeneity of kind of, they're all thin, they're all middle class, they're all well educated, they're all kind of that sort of middle class smug, I've got it together thing. And the appeal of a bit of pratfall, rightly or wrongly, is perfectly understandable. But my wife, interestingly, is a vicar and a priest and a hospital chaplain. And while she did her training, she was sort of advised by another vicar, as makes sense. And the other vicar, fascinatingly, a woman in her 50s, I suppose, smoked. And she said the most surprising thing to my wife, which was that it is hugely valuable in talking to people with problems that you have a failing yourself. Because if you come across as too perfect, your capacity to empathize or give advice to someone is much, much more difficult because it becomes interpreted as kind of patronizing de haut en bas talking down. Whereas if you have a failing of your own, where you have to nip out another, cheeky Rothmans halfway through the thing, it somehow makes the whole thing much, much easier.
Now, asking the general public for their opinion, be it on Brexit or boat names, is notoriously fraught with danger, but that's not stopped us inviting them in. So we'll start with copywriter Lucy. And she asks, are there any psychological hacks mums and dads can apply to parenting?
Yes. That's a great question, actually. One of the things that fascinates me about behavioral science is that it's scalable in a way that advertising isn't. So the same patterns that can be of use in, for example, selling diapers or whatever it may be, can also be applicable at the very smallest level. And the same peculiarities that emerge when people make a major decision like buying a house can affect minor ones. So one great one with children is you placebo choice, or indeed the possibly even dummy options. But if you say, I want you to go to bed at X, an alternative way to do it is to leave the person with some agency, the child in this case. And you say, for example, you can either eat this and then go to bed, or you can eat something else and then go to bed. Okay? The fact that there's no choice over going to bed, reframing a question, but leaving the other person with some agency tends to focus on the area over which they do have control rather than the area over which they don't. And that, by the way, applies to children. It also applies to voters, adults, all sorts of things. I mean, one of the great rants I have about tax is that it gives you no choice over where the money goes. Now, I think people would feel fundamentally differently about paying incremental tax if there were a degree of hypothecation allowed, which the Treasury resists completely, but I think this is a mistake. Anyway, psychologically, it's a huge mistake. Now, I'd also say that, the TV license should probably come with 2 or 3 levels of option now for the BBC. I would pay the maximum amount and get the complete back catalogue of BBC programmes dating back to, Alva Liddell or whatever. Other people could pay less and get slightly less. I think that would be reasonable. But no, other things, for example, are very simply, okay, Jiu-jitsu teaches this as well, in a sense. Okay, if my wife wants me to take the rubbish out, okay, the bad way is wait while I'm watching TV in my pants and tell me to take the rubbish out, okay, which is something which now the alternative is simply leave the bag of rubbish by the back door and say nothing. Now, when I'm by the back door, I already have my shoes on and I'm dressed by definition because I'm about to leave the house. The rubbish is there already, and I would actually feel like a prat not carrying it downstairs. So there's a really important point here in changing behavior, which is don't just say, I want this to happen and tell people. Wait for a moment at which actually it doesn't require persuasion at all. It's simply a natural course of action. And that applies to getting someone to take the rubbish out. It also, is how building societies sell home insurance with a mortgage, because it seems entirely natural at that point, whereas trying to sell the same thing in isolation is much, much harder.
Yeah, that's a great example. Sticking with wives then, my wife Sophie has actually pleaded me to put this question to you. So she's asked, what's your favourite alcoholic drink? We know it's not wine. She's then said, and type of gin. So I think she's anticipated gin being the answer.
It's not only gin, by the way. By the way, I'm not entirely alone in this. Julia Childs, the fantastic American food writer and writer on French food, she was asked, what's your favourite wine? And used to reply, gin. I like cocktails and mixed drinks. Funnily enough, I don't really have a favourite drink because I quite like a degree of variety, including wine, by the way. My big beef, my hatred of wine really stems from the fact that it's served without food. Which, by the way, very few French or Italian people would just stand around at a party drinking red wine without a meal. Okay, you'd have champagne, that's fine. Okay, you could have some sort of Kier thing, which the French might make, or that thing where you chuck, something into sparkling wine. But actually, red and white wine without food is shit. Okay, and by the way, it's also shit red and white wine typically when it's served that way. It's also really, really annoying because it doesn't really. Red and white is fake choice. Okay, you get to choose the color, but basically the drink's kind of the same. So I think that's an example of placebo choice, which everybody goes, oh well, I've chosen to drink red, so therefore that's what I wanted to drink. When in reality, had there been any other option, we would have had something else. I do have a very good tip for lunchtime drink, which is Sloe Gin and tonic. Now, Sloe Gin is actually very lucrative for the gin makers, so they'll be grateful to me here, because it's taxed significantly less, but tends to be priced at the same price as gin, because it's only got 20%, it's half the alcoholic strength. It's only 20% alcohol, not 40, typically. But for that reason, and for the coloration, it makes a great lunchtime drink. Because it's essentially, less alcoholic than wine, for example, per volume. But for whatever reason, it doesn't feel like it. So I think there's a psychological element where you derive some of the pleasure of drinking gin and tonic in terms of general merriment, but the soporific effect seems to be reduced. So that would be slow gin and tonic would definitely be a bit of a useful tip, of which, by the way, most of the great, of course, as an Ogilvy person, Sipsmith is obviously the first one you should buy, but other brands are available.
Yes. And therein is the reason why they're often in the Nudgestock goodie bags.
Funny that, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. It was we love it. We go every year as an agency. And it's our highlight of the year on the event schedule.
That's fantastic. Oh, wonderful to hear. Now, what I'd like to think is it's the physical embodiment of Jeremy Bullmore's point that the best books about advertising aren't always about advertising. And so we want a conference which is partly, not exclusively, for advertising people, which isn't only about advertising. Because I think the great problem of the advertising marketing industry is it has become a bubble. It's become self-reflective. It's become obsessed with peer group approval, which then creates a kind of homogeneity. And the great discovery I made in my sort of 20-year quest was that actually there are people in science, including behavioral economists and indeed evolutionary scientists, who understand advertising very, very well. The people who don't understand it, economists instinctively hate it, finance people instinctively hate it, because their model of the world is predicated on the assumption that we already know what we want. And as a result, they see advertising at best as a kind of necessary evil and as a cost to be minimized. They don't see it as a source of value creation. Whereas, as you will have seen from my talk at Nudgestock, Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian school of economists, if you go and talk to people who are a bit Austrian, Hayekian economists, they believe that marketing is as much a source of value creation as manufacturing is. Because in order for something to actually make someone want to buy it, you can't simply construct the thing. You have to construct the context in which the thing is saleable. Just as you have to design a restaurant so that meals served there are enjoyable.
The final part of the interview then, Rory, is our 4 pertinent poses, which we put to all of our guests. So number 1, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Very simply, don't have too much of a plan. Because nothing significant that ever happens in your life was ever really anticipated. And that if you obsess too much about your plan, weirdly, you're narrowing down optionalities. The other thing which I've given before as advice is try to be quite good at two things rather than brilliant at one. Simply because if you try and be the best tennis player in the world, you're almost certainly going to fail. Whereas if you have two related talents, they have to overlap slightly, you know. But if you have two interests which overlap, the one can feed off the other and vice versa. And secondly, you have a combination of talents which is much, much rarer than a sole talent. So, in a weird kind of way, it's very interesting to see how, in the longer term, I'd argue that people who have a foot in more than one camp tend to have more room to maneuver. You also, by the way, have much more wiggle room. I think that's vitally important. And it's worth remembering, by the way, when you look at people who are really, really successful in a predefined field, we look at them and we fail to account for the 150 people who tried to be them and failed. And this, by the way, is really important because if you think about it, if you look at parenting, there's a whole gig for, if you're Serena Williams' dad, okay, and you basically trained your children to be Wimbledon champions from birth, and you succeeded, okay, there's a whole place on stage for you to go up to say to Americans, look how really, really trying and caring causes you to be able to succeed in extraordinary ways, blah, blah, blah. And Americans believe this shit. I mean, to an astoundingly horrible degree. And Americans believe in personal agency and the extent that effort is rewarded. I mean, maybe for 70 years in American history, it was kind of true. Maybe the place was, in a sense, so economically extraordinary that there was a period where basically if you had a reasonable amount of ability and you tried pretty hard, you would be you would be successful. But it's worth remembering, okay, that, for every person who made it to the Wimbledon final with that kind of upbringing, there are probably 5 kids at the moment who are in a crack den somewhere, still cursing their dad for forcing them to play tennis too much. And equally, don't forget, if you want to go and give a talk on stage in the United States about how hard work led to success for your children, say, or how what you did in your childbearing that made your kids so successful, there's a market for really ambitious dads to stand up and talk. Now, Ronald Reagan's dad was kind of deadbeat alcoholic, right? He was never going to get a speaking gig going, basically, I just went down to the pub and, ooh, look, my kid's the president of the United States. Okay? There isn't a market for that narrative. So the narratives that prevail are disproportionately those which lie around single-minded intent and focus. And no one's going to stand on stage saying, look, I'm a multimillionaire. That was lucky, wasn't it? Okay. Now, if we're honest, Robert Frank, by the way, his book, Success and Luck, is a must read because one thing I think, which is very interesting, it's a very interesting question, the whole question around luck, because it's sort of a left-wing point, which I think rightly it is, which is to say that, look, if the people who are disproportionately successful are lucky, okay, the extent to which they deserve their insane wealth may be slightly diminished. And of course, to Americans, that's an absolute anathema to say that. On the other hand, Nassim Taleb makes an interesting point, which is if you have a market system, an economic system where luck isn't rewarded, okay, then you miss out on 70% of improvement. Because if you imagine a world where we weren't allowed to use the scientific advances that had emerged through luck, we'd have no radar, we'd have no penicillin, we'd have no antibiotics, we'd have no microwaves, we'd have we wouldn't be allowed to talk about the microwave background because that was discovered by luck, I think, as well. Okay, so there'd be loads and loads of things which essentially wouldn't exist. We'd be living in a kind of, Edwardian era of science. Okay, now in the same way, if a guy who's, to be honest, merely lucky opens a restaurant which turns into a massive success, We need a mechanism that rewards that and him, A, for taking the risk in the first place, for doing something uncertain, but B, we need it so that lucky restaurants prevail and unlucky restaurants fail. Now, so if you had a restaurant which is founded by the professor of restaurants at Catering University, okay, and that fails, and you have some total blag artist who happens to start a restaurant in the right place at the right time, and it's a huge success. In the Soviet Union, they keep the first restaurant going and kill the second one. Okay, the market mechanism is very largely there to make sure that the valuable discoveries that emerge through luck and happenstance survive, whereas unlucky ideas, which have been promoted with all the best reasons and arguments in the world, but simply don't work for whatever reason, we need those to die. Now, that, again, if you want to make a really, really if you want to totally fetishize the entrepreneur, that isn't a popular narrative. But I think it's quite largely true, to be honest.
Yeah.
My dad was in a property business where, he had a very, very good idea and essentially was killed by a property crash financially, which was entirely outside his control. Now, Nassim Taleb has a very good way of framing that, which is that an entrepreneur who fails in business is no more to be criticized than a soldier who dies in battle.
Yeah, that's a lovely way of framing it.
You've taken the chance, you've tried. In many cases, the reasons for your failure are entirely beyond your control, or they're simply beyond human comprehension. I mean, lots of things. If you think about it, Dyson, Starbucks. Coca-Cola in Britain. Okay, Coke had come to me in like 1930 or whatever and said, "We want to launch this drink in Britain." Well, first read to me, it tastes a bit funny. I prefer Vimto. I prefer Vimto. What's the other one? Vimto or depending on where you live in the country, it used to be there were those two British soft drinks, weren't there? There was Tizer. That was it, Tizer or Vimto. So no, it doesn't taste as nice as Tizer. And then we come up with a load of reasons. Say, look, the thing you got to understand, Yanks, is that the thing with is that Britain, we drink tea, okay. We don't have a major prohibition hang up, so we drink a hell of a lot of alcohol. If we want a cold drink, lots of them have alcohol in, okay? Basically, the climate here is shit, okay, and ice is treated like a luxury good. So the likelihood that Coke's going to be successful in the UK just, doesn't strike me as very plausible. If I'd been Red Bull, for God's sake, who would have recommended that? And so in many cases, the thing that determines success may be something so psychologically weird or counterintuitive that it's simply unrealistic for anybody to actually identify it in advance. I mean, I love Coke as a drink. I also think, by the way, people always criticize it, but wait a second, okay? If you're trying not to drink alcohol and you're in any social setting, what other drink is there? Let's be absolutely honest, okay? So before we start going, oh, Coke, it's the embodiment of evil, blah, 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 blah. Okay, yeah, that may be true. If you talk to anybody who doesn't drink, they're really, really grateful for the existence of Diet Coke. Because they said the problem with middle-class bloody Brits is they have these parties and they go, oh, we won't have Coca-Cola, will we, dear? So what we'll have is... Now, actually, in fairness, those elderflower drinks are kind of okay, in fairness. But if you have a party and you don't want to drink because you're driving and the fuckers, all they'll serve is orange juice and water, I want to punch them in the face. Because orange juice is perfectly tolerable for the first one, but after that, it's a children's drink. It's too sweet. Water's fucking boring beyond a certain point. Don't get me wrong. If I'm really thirsty, water's a great drink. Okay, but basically water's sodding dull for a 4-hour party. And so a party where you can't smoke and the only bloody drinks on offer are orange juice and water, you're imposing an extraordinary unkindness on people who either need to drive a car or don't want to drink alcohol. And so let's be clear about this. I mean, Coke in the beverage pantheon, it does occupy a space which it's necessary for something to occupy.
Yeah, it does. It totally does. Rory, if you could banish one thing from the industry, what would it be and why?
I wouldn't banish anything, really, because I don't think it's that kind of industry. I mean, obviously, The vocabulary would be the first one, I think, which is we can't go on. I'm now this is I'm going to be really careful here because Ogilvy's main line is we make brands matter. I'm not 100% comfortable with the use of the word brand, except in a marketing context, because I don't think people outside, well, I don't think anybody understands it actually, but I don't think anybody outside the industry feels comfortable with the word. And I think now that's an extreme case. I think brand is okay. I mean, ultimately, but I think most marketing vocabulary is fine. The best phrase, Alistair Graham, a very good copywriter, said, marketing vocabulary, he said, is like the vocabulary of astrology, which is if you're talking to fellow believers, it sounds fine. If you're talking to anybody else, you sound like a lunatic. And I think that's a really, really important point. Because as I've rephrased that by saying, going to a finance director and talking about brand iconography is like going to the head of thoracic surgery at St Mary's Hospital and going, let's all trust to the healing power of the crystal. I mean, it just sounds completely stupid. And so whereas every other area of business can ally itself with some recognizable science, we've been operating alone with our own stupid vocabulary. And so aligning ourselves with a mixture of complexity, science, understanding of chaos and decision-making under uncertainty. Yeah, they're fringe sciences, but they're sciences. And the one gift they have to give to us above anything else is a vocabulary which makes us sound at least the fact that actually very interesting insight. Okay, many great advertising end lines contain an element of self-contradiction. Guinness, good things come to those who wait. There's a negative in there. You've got to wait for your pint to be poured. If you take, for example, we're number 2, so we try harder. Now, it's very, very difficult talking to a totally logical person to explain why you'd want to put a negative in an advertising line. But the Pratfall Effect, or what Robert Cialdini calls something else, it's the idea of the admitted negative, is actually a potent, persuasive vehicle.
Yeah, well said. Rory, so aside from Alchemy, are there any books that you would recommend to our listeners? So we've had 2 come up already. So we've had Complexity and the Art of Public Policy, and we've had Success and Luck by Robert Frank.
I'd read the Taleb canon. I'd probably start at the beginning with, I think, Fooled by Randomness.
Okay.
I think that's important. Basically, I'm in favour of all books which, not necessarily claiming to be a secret, the solution to everything, at least give you the power to think about something in a different frame. And so I'd also include Robert Frank's The Darwin Economy. I'd include, actually, The Mating Mind and Spent by Geoffrey Miller. Very interesting book. I'd include, actually, although I disagree with him on a lot of things, The Selfish Gene, Deceit and Self-Deception by Robert Trivers, The Selfish Gene, or similar works. You could look at other works by, there's a book by the geneticist, I think, called Steve Jones, I think it's called River Out of Eden, but I think to understand evolutionary biology is important because it's the first attempt to understand sort of complex emergent properties of things as distinct from simple physical universes. It's also, if you think about it, Darwin's is a theory about how things change, not about how things are. And I think for behavior change and for marketing, understanding how the world changes and how therefore one can influence it, perhaps, or at least simply understand how you can spot trends, spot what is happening, is a more important talent, than having a theory about what would be an ideal world, because you might not be able to get from A to B. And so, that's one of my theories about, if you think about it, Marxism started as a theory about what was going to happen. It was really a predictive book rather than a prescriptive book. I think that understanding is really important, that what we have to do is, if you want to get from A to B, you have to understand the means by which you get there and the time frame at which it's possible, by the way. What's happening with electric cars now is really interesting to me, because it's going to play absolute havoc with the conventional car industry as lots of people effectively hold on to their old cars while not knowing where to jump next. They know that the next jump may have to be to something that's hybrid or electric, but because they don't yet know where to jump, as a result, they're holding on to their old cars artificially. And so, understanding all those things that may happen, I think, how do you get people to install solar panels is a really interesting question. Now, my argument is what we really need is John Lewis to sell and install solar panels.
Mm.
That actually it's very interesting because marketing is much, I can almost end on this. Marketing is much more important to innovation than innovators think it is. Any fool can invent something at some level. Getting people to adopt it is often the more difficult challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And
I mean, I think Uber and Dyson and so forth may largely be marketing successes, which are then written by Harvard Business Review as though they were business successes.
Yeah, it's easy to post-rationalize and tell a completely different story.
Oh, yeah, you can always do that. Yeah. Dyson satisfies the market need for really expensive, transparent vacuum cleaners that look cool. No one knew that fucking thing existed until Dyson came along.
Exactly that. So lastly, we always dedicate every show to someone, and we bestow or hospital pass that honour, depending on your view, to our guest, who also has to give their reason why.
Actually, I'll do the obvious thing and dedicate it to my wife, who made the fantastic and I think deal-breaking suggestion that my book consists of lots of short chapters. And the truth of the matter is that if you spent your whole life as a copywriter, you become very good, and also writing in the Spectator, you become very good at 600 words, 1,000 words, 500 words, etc. Your capacity for doing large-scale structure. And what I did is I did the large-scale structure, which sort of worked. But then actually, my wife suggested I reimpose, keep the large-scale structure, but actually pretend there isn't a large-scale structure and break it up into lots of short chapters, which I think makes it inordinately more readable. And actually, I think that was an incredibly valuable suggestion.
Absolutely. And whose idea was it for you to narrate the audiobook?
Oh, me. Partly because if you have the audiobook narrated by an actor or audiobook reader, the entire focus, 100%, is on fidelity to the original text. So you can't even change a do not into a don't. You can't add little verbal asides or little things. You can't change the phraseology or even the tonality or reframe a sentence so that it's better spoken than read. And so it's only the author. They will actually ring up an author and say, is it okay if we change do not to don't? Okay, well, I didn't want to be rung up 17 times with stupid questions, but also the freedom to recast a sentence so that it's speech-friendly rather than text-friendly strikes me as immensely important in terms of how you do the book.
Well, I've really enjoyed the audiobook.
Oh, good to hear.
I have both, but no, the audiobook is fantastic.
I think I'm going to get slightly more royalties for the audiobook, so plug ahead.
I will do. So, Rory, as a final call to action, everyone listening, head over to calltoaction.co. We'll share everything, including links to the audiobook version of Alchemy and everything else we've discussed. How else can people get more Rory Sutherland?
Good question. If you Google me and the month and the year, most of my speaking events that are public will be later on coming up. There's a How to Academy talk, I think in September, October. So that's the thing. Look up How to Academy, and I should be talking. It's a second version of a talk I gave earlier in the year for the spillover audience. I gave the earlier one at the Royal Institution, and I think that might be the best thing to Google for now.
Fantastic. And also, we haven't had time to cover it, sadly, on this recording, but I couldn't recommend Rory's talk. I think it was a Wired event on the topic of placebos. I couldn't recommend that enough. It's absolutely fantastic. So maybe start with that.
We're very happy to do that. Wonderful.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Rory, for joining. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to talk to you.
Likewise. See you soon. And thank you very much for the invitation.
And thank you to everyone listening. Please continue to share and review. To get in touch with questions to put to our guests or to give us feedback of any flavour, simply email us at hello@calltoaction.co.
to action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try.